5% of its GDP in education, which is slightly below the OECD average. And it only spends 1.2% of GDP in research and development, in R&D. So this means that Spain, compared to the leading countries in Europe, especially Western Europe, but also Eastern Europe, increasingly Central and Eastern Europe, is a bit of a laggard. It doesn't do terribly well in terms of information technology and the knowledge-based economy. Originally, of course, the Spanish government was one of the most enthusiastic governments when it came to proposing the so-called Lisbon agenda within the EU, but sadly Spain has really failed to meet many of the targets that were fixed in the Lisbon agenda. And I would argue that this government's, one of this government's tasks should be to try and rethink the Lisbon agenda. Where do we go from here? What sort of post-Lisbon do we want? One of the questions that we've debated at great length within our institute is how can and should Spain try to make the best of its resources, its political, social, and economic resources? How should it try to increase its visibility and its influence worldwide? And I suppose the not terribly original answer that we've come up with is that we should try to encourage the authorities and society in general to strike a new balance when it comes to combining elements of hard power and soft power. All countries in the world, of course, have both hard and soft power, but the balance between these two elements can fluctuate very considerably from one country to another. And what we have proposed in this document that I've been mentioning, I suppose, is that Spain should try to carve out a niche for itself, which would enable it to make the best of its geostrategic, economic and social potential, and which would eventually lead it to find a new role as a medium-sized power of significant regional importance, but with certain global aspirations. And the areas, the strengths on which we believe that Spanish foreign policy could and should be built in the future are the following. First of all, we would like to see the authorities and civil society generally more involved in the promotion of certain values. One of the greatest assets that Spain has, of course, is its recent political legacy. It undertook, as you know, an extremely successful transition to democracy in the 70s and the 80s, which has been studied with interest, not only in Latin America, but also in Central and Eastern Europe, and even as far afield as South Africa, South Korea, and elsewhere. It really has become a model which has attracted worldwide interest. Secondly, still within this political sphere, Spain, of course, as you know, is a multicultural nation. Some would argue that it is a multinational state. There is a very lively debate about this. But regardless of where you stand on this issue, the interesting thing is that Spain is actually making a very significant contribution to, if you like, the theoretical and practical debate about the future of federalism and federal institutions. Most of our countries, of course, with the exception of Portugal, there are very few countries represented around this table, probably, where nation and state coalesce perfectly. In other words, practically all of our states contain minorities of one sort or another. And Spain's so-called semi-federal system, on the whole, experts here don't describe it normally as a fully fledged federal system. We prefer to describe it as a semi-federal system. But whatever the term we actually use, one could argue that this system, which is still in a state of evolution, and of course, as you know, this is a very controversial process, is nevertheless a very interesting contribution to this debate. Also in connection with this, as I mentioned earlier, one can argue that in 30, 40 years, Spanish society has experienced a more radical transformation than that of practically any country in Europe, from this relative backwardness that I was referring to earlier to the current situation. And also in terms of social mores, social behavior, social attitudes to issues such as same-sex marriages, etc., the changes have been extremely profound. So there's a social capital. What I'm arguing here is that there's an interesting social capital here that I think could be made more of. Secondly, on the economic front, of course, it's difficult to talk up the Spanish economy right now, given the state of the world crisis. And as you know, Spain is one of the countries that's been worst hit by the economic crisis. Our unemployment level is currently 18%, which is well above the EU average. This is partly due to the fact that during the last 20 years, Spain was the country in the world which received most immigrants, with the only exception of the United States. Spain has received more immigrants than any other country in the world during the last 10 to 15 years, with the only exception of the US, approximately 4.5, 5 million people. So obviously this is having a big impact in the current economic downturn. However, I'm not trying to be artificially optimistic, but I would like to remind you that Spain has experienced very severe recessions in the past, most notably in 1992, 93, and overcome that recession quite well. There is an interesting debate right now as to what the permanent or long-term consequences of the current crisis will be. Will this crisis actually lead to a shift in the pecking order, both internationally and within the EU context? Or is this simply a hiccup from which we will all more or less recover simultaneously without any greater longer-term consequences? That's an open question to my mind. Partly as a result of its ancient history, but also more recent history, I think Spain can also be seen as an interesting crossroads. Spain has a certain ability to deal with countries that others find trouble dealing with, countries like Iran and Turkey. Spain is at a geostrategic crossroads, you could argue, in areas such as terrorism. Of course, I don't have to remind you of the 11th of March 2004 terrorist attacks in which 192 people were killed. It's also at the crossroads of the energy, security, climate change debate. Spain is very dependent on imported energy, and that has forced Spain to become a world leader in energy renewables. But also in terms of climate change. According to the experts, Spain is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to the consequences of climate change. And one could argue that Spain is at the crossroads of what Huntington described as the clash of civilizations and what our Prime Minister describes as the alliance of civilizations. In other words, it's at the crossroads of, it's at an interface in global terms, in global civilizational terms. Let me not forget culture. Spain, of course, has a very significant cultural legacy. The linguistic factor plays a big role in this, as I've mentioned, but also architectural, artistic, and other forms of culture. It is one of the world's leading cultural players, and this is something, again, that should perhaps be brought into play more actively. So, to conclude, basically we feel that Spain continues to find it difficult to carve out a role for itself in the international system. Of course, the international system is in flux, and this government is advocating a philosophy, if you like, an approach to the evolution of the international system, which may or may not be conducive to carving out this role for itself. This government strongly believes in international law and the institutions of international law, above all the United Nations. It strongly believes in what the EU calls effective multilateralism. The use of force, for historic reasons, has not really enjoyed much legitimacy in Spain during the 20th century. This is probably a legacy, not surprising legacy, of the Civil War, and public opinion is on the whole reluctant to project force, as the captain well knows. So there is a certain problem when it comes to advocating the use of force, even, I think, in cases where there is a very strong argument in favor of doing so. I've mentioned the language on a couple of issues. I sometimes wonder, perhaps, and this is something that we should probably discuss in the context of the use of internet and so on, whether the Spanish language isn't, to some extent, a false friend. What do I mean by this? Well, the fact that 400 million people speak Spanish in the world leads Spaniards to underestimate the importance of knowing other languages. there is this tendency to assume that others should speak Spanish, perhaps. Or there is this tendency to assume that because Spanish is a world language, Spaniards don't need to make the effort. I'm an Anglo-Spaniard myself, so I'm very familiar with this problem from a British perspective, as you can imagine. So although, obviously, in terms of projecting its influence and its presence abroad, the Spanish language can be a wonderful instrument, I think it is also, at a certain level, an impediment to the internationalization of the Spanish economy and perhaps Spanish attitudes more generally. Okay, so let me just conclude on this note. What I wanted to share with you is the existence of a debate. Captain, in his very kind introductory remarks, mentioned a very lively debate which is currently taking place among the international